Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are tonight's entertainment.
Sound good?
Yes, sir! I know who I am!
Did IQs just drop shot while I was away?
I have a plan.
I like this shit.
You know, it's exciting.
Dance off, bro.
It is your
Me and you.
destiny.
Welcome to the Atlantic Screen Connection Podcast.
Let the games begin.
Hello and welcome to the Atlantic Screen Connection Podcast with Jason and Lee. I'm Jason.
I'm Lee.
And this week we are going to be tackling Shane Carruth's 2013 film Upstream Color. We were just fresh off Ghost Story, and we realized that Shane Carruth had edited a Ghost Story.
It was in the episode. We had talked about it. Well, we had joked about it. It was a misunderstanding. Yeah. But I guess it sort of, planted the seed. Because we had actually planned on talking about this, this film. We had planned on doing it like a year ago.
Yeah, absolutely, a year ago. I mean, and I'm the one who got cold feet. I think I wasn't ready at the time. I had watched it, and for some reason it hadn't really settled in my brain as something that I was capable of attacking at that point in time. I felt like I needed to kind of just let it, I don't know.
Yeah, fester a little longer.
Yeah, I don't know. It's sometimes you just get that feeling. I remember when we had started recording There Will Be Blood, there was one of those instances where I was like, I can't do this today because my brain's just not in it. And when it came to Upstream Color, I had pitched it to you because I really wanted to attack the film, and I'm glad that we're doing it today. But it was one of those movies that I was like, I have to get this one right, and I have to do it justice. And
I feel passionately about this.
Exactly.
And if I fuck it up, I'll never be able to do it again.
Exactly. I feel like, well, the pressure's on for today. But at the same time,
whatever.
Yeah, but I feel this is a movie that I really, really like, and I've been hoping to get to it for a long time, and I think that 1 year difference really has given me a little bit more. I think, you know what, to be honest, Ghost Story was the one that opened my mind to potentially being able to analyze this one in a proper way.
It's very fitting that this is followed, not just because of the people who worked on it, how it's fitting, but also it's fitting because the narratives are told in a very similar way.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that we did this a year from when we had planned to, because the way I tackled this show is totally different from what I would have done at the last time. I would have came in very able-minded to have a discussion, but like nothing prepared, hoping for the best.
Yeah.
And also this film, it's weird because it's one of those ones that I'm not a big second watch guy.
Okay.
I don't really do that for a lot of films, and the films that I do it for, I tend not to get a lot from it. But this was one of those ones that, even though I had the general makeup of the film still fresh in my mind from watching it a year ago,
right,
I so benefited from seeing it a second time because I could relax, because I was able to enjoy so many of the things that while mind racing left, right, trying to piece it together the first time, I would never have been able to get until a second watch. Just things in like imagery, because there's so much of it so quickly. You're racing to keep up with it. I'm so glad I got a second chance to zero in on bits and pieces and go, oh, okay, that's a relief. Or more importantly, I got to enjoy the film more this time. I wasn't trying to work the film. I was just allowing the film to play, and then I just got into it. I was just enjoying what is just a really well pieced together work, and not just something that represents a challenge in my life,
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I feel like almost exactly the same. However, I still feel it's a challenge because, I've watched it 3 times.
Oh, not to belittle it.
Yeah. And even the first time I watched it, I was actually, I was sick, and I had stayed home from work. My girlfriend was still in university at the time. She was getting set to graduate, but she was home from school that day because she didn't have a class. And I told her, I says, listen, I'm going to sit down. In the time I had a rocking chair here, and now I don't have it anymore.
Not great for recording rocking chairs.
No, exactly. And I watched it on my iPad, which a lot of people would consider it's a sin, but at the same time, I had headphones on, which really enhanced the viewing. And I remember finishing the film the first time and turning to Leslie and saying, Jesus fucking Christ, I just watched something that was mind-boggling but eye-opening at the same time. And part of me really, really enjoyed it. And another part of me was like, okay, this is one that I'm going to have to rewatch over and over again because there's no way in hell that I'm going to understand everything that's going on. And this was back in 2013, so 4 years ago. I had watched it another time last year when we were gearing up to possibly do it. And then I got cold feet because I was like, I'm not ready yet. I can't do it. And now, like I said, total now I've watched it 5 times. And I'll be honest, even when I was watching it again this week in preparation for this, there's just so much to talk about that I couldn't write everything down.
Absolutely.
You know,
well, exactly. You know, I just when it came to writing notes, I just went with a interpretation. But I mean, ultimately, because it's such an open and interpretive work, it's really going to benefit more from further discussion. So, I mean, those listening to this, you might, there'll be pieces that, I mean, if you watched it and you thought, what the fuck was that about? You'll probably definitely get something from this episode because we at least think we know what we're talking about. But, at the same time, it's one of those ones you could be so way off. You know, or you could miss the initial fission, even if you're talking about something in similar terms.
Yeah.
And I would hope that we don't, but I would say that while listening to us talk about it might be good, it's maybe better to start your own conversations about it, and try to pick it apart with somebody who enjoyed the film and try to piece together yourselves just to see what you've come up with, because it's one of those ones that it's not going to stop as soon as this episode stops, you know?
No, that's it. I mean, we pointed this out on the Ghost Story episode as well, that Ghost Story is somewhat similar in that way where whatever you bring to the film, you're going to get something out of it, you know, whatever basic knowledge you have about certain situations, about certain objects, certain things. I mean, Carruth is actually playing with that subjectivity, if you will. And I think it's kind of interesting because, you know, even like what you were pointing out, there was a couple of people on Twitter that when I told them that this is going to be the next episode, there's Jameson Worsley, I think his name is called, @WarlJame. He says it's one of the most what the fuck films I've ever seen. And Carrie Lynn, our frequent collaborator, Carrie Lynn at Carrie Lynnland, she said, "But what the fuck in a good way?" with a giant exclamation point. That was
all
great.
caps.
And I just wanted to give a shout out also to a hipster pop geek at Stephen M. Keller. So Stephen had pointed out that he's owned the movie for years, and he guessed that he should finally watch it based on the fact that we're going to be covering it on the show.
We're actually going to be covering it. We appreciate your dedication as always, Stephen.
Yeah, it's super cool. We love it, man. And so that's it. We've got these things, like people have been putting it off the same way as we had put it off in Stephen. So hopefully as we're talking about it, like after I play the trailer, we're going to come up with our own little things. We're going to go into our little, discussions, but hopefully the discussion is going to actually help us see differently as well, because I know that Lee is not going to see this the same way I did, and I'm positive I didn't see the same things that Lee did. So this should be a really, really fun one. I'm really prepared to attack it, and I can't wait to get into it. So shall we play the trailer, sir?
Let's do it, man.
Every week on Real Spoilers, what we do is we take that week's big release on the weeks that we guess right, and we spoil it for you. So if you saw a movie and you want to talk about it with your friends, but maybe you don't have any friends, we can be your friends in podcast form. We'll talk about the movie in rich, vibrant detail, and it's kind of like a book club for movies.
Yeah, we're just a bunch of movie nerds.
Yeah, and so it's just a long-form conversation about the movie, going through its plot, talking about what worked, and a lot of times what didn't, and making fun of it when it doesn't work. And if you like the show, feel free to share it on your Facebook, social media, Twitter, verse thing stuff. So that's what we do on Real Spoilers. It's like a book club for movies, only with less Oprah.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pop Culture Case Study.
Hi, I'm David Hart, host of Pop Culture Case Study, a podcast that analyzes film from a psychological angle. On Thursdays, we take a look at an older movie, pick a theme, and then apply the research that has been in the psychological field to it. Then, on Monday, we tie all of that to a new release. Lastly, there's a section of the show called Fangirl Fixation, dedicated to my wife Britt's ongoing film education. We discuss older films that she's recently seen, as well as the upcoming releases for that week. You can find Pop Culture Case Study on your podcast player of choice, and I will be there, as always, diagnosing your favorites and judging you for what you watch.
Do you know this place?
I want to say yes.
Go in there, just go in there.
For you. I want to.
I haven't slept at all. Is there Is there a direction that you feel drawn?
I'm gonna go wherever you go. You know that. You're scaring me a little bit.
I feel like you know.
Won't let anyone near them. There's a crowd back in the corner. Violent. I've never seen the parents behave so.
They can get very protective.
The water before you is somehow special. It is better than anything you've ever tasted. Each drink is better than the last.
Hey, Sheila.
Take a drink now.
And welcome back. We hope you guys enjoyed the trailer for Upstream Color, a film directed by Shane Carruth that stars Shane Carruth and Amy Simons. Lee, what did you think about the film, man? General impressions first. I know we just had a little bit of a conversation before the trailer, but I mean, we didn't really say if we actually enjoyed the film or not. So, did you like the film?
Yeah, I mean, Jameson hit the nail on the head, man. It really is. I mean, for first watch, it was definitely a what the fuck film. I mean, and you said it too when reading that synopsis. I didn't read the synopsis. Maybe that was a mistake because some preparation for what you're kind of getting into might be necessary. Because
I disagree, but keep going.
Well, I mean, like it depends on the viewer. Like I survived.
Yeah.
But I think that was because I've watched a lot of films analytically, so I can piece myself together from wherever I land. Whereas I don't know, I think like a lot of people, like if the opening scene is a guy taking out rubbish and a bunch of kids playing around and mimicking each other, it all seems a little like Lynchian surreal, you know.
Yeah, I get that.
Even when dialogue is introduced to the film, it doesn't really start. I mean, I guess when it comes to like the brainwashing sequence, that's when you kind of get what's going on for the first time.
Yeah,
it's very easy to keep track of that, and then you lose it again because the film goes all over in different directions with 3 interlocking stories, kind of 4, 3.5, all different places, maybe different times. You don't know how long it is between these takes. You know, you don't.
Yeah,
really,
absolutely right. Yeah.
It could be like because of changing haircuts and clothes. This could be days, weeks, years. You know, you don't really know what the fuck's going on. Mm-hmm. Every bit of imagery is kind of telling you a lot of different information at one time, and I think to a lot of viewers that's going to be an immediate no-go. You know, it's one of those films that just puts up a brick wall if you're not ready to engage with the fact that the film doesn't want to give you a straight narrative. And that's something I hope I said about A Ghost Story as well, because it's very much the same thing. While there is a character, I suppose, who's present, you can follow through, it doesn't really give you any tangible. It's more about the experience, at least. I mean, not that there isn't, you know, cement stuff underneath the imagery that you can use, but I think the impression is supposed to be, if you watch this one time, it's about an experience that you kind of pick up on bits and pieces that may be applicable to you, and that's very much like A Ghost Story. You know, you'll feel grief and you'll feel that desperate loneliness, and that even though you might not understand exactly what it's trying to say, it'll hit you at times. That, you know, music, sound, things will just catch you.
Yeah.
And it wants you to focus more on that than trying to make sense of the film. Upstream Color is exactly that kind of film.
Right.
I guess me going into it first time round with an analytical mindset, because I knew we were doing it for an episode, I was getting battered all left, right, and center because I couldn't keep up, you know?
Yeah.
But as I was saying, second time round, easier, just took it for what it was, got to enjoy it a lot more. And I think if I were to recommend people, it is one of those films. You always say this on the show, you know, it's one of those films. It's challenging for a reason. It's the kind of shit we should be watching. You know, you need a break from the sort of processed blockbuster stuff that you usually watch.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to do it, it should be something with a little, artistry about it, like Upstream Color and A Ghost Story. So
throw yourself a curveball is what I say.
Yeah, curveball. That's exactly what you said. So I would absolutely say this is one of those ones, but I much like curveballs, I wouldn't expect you to enjoy it. I
That's a sad fact, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, but it is true. I mean, I know I enjoyed it generally first time watching, but this is one of those ones that if I got something from it a second time round, and I usually don't depend on that,
right?
Then it's one of those ones that I'm going to absolutely recommend people see twice, because once you've seen it once, your mind will absorb that much, at least half the information necessary to enjoy it, right. and from there, it'll be a little more breezy when you return to it. You might not understand it at any point. I mean, again, experiential, you're maybe not supposed to.
See, that I agree with. Remember when we were talking about Inherent Vice? The first time when you sit down to watch it and you try to pick it apart, it just becomes so weird that it is supposed to be taken as an experience. And you hit the nail on the head right there with Upstream Color, because like I said, and I say this often on the show, is that I use my parents as a barometer for who the audience is for, right?
Absolutely.
And I don't, if I think maybe Dad would get something out of this, but my mom would be like, we're going to have to stop talking to you now, because you can't recommend these types of movies, because we're sitting there going what the fuck?
I'm not taking a recommendation from you. You keep giving us shit.
Exactly. One of my friends, DS here, I remember recommending he watch Gus Van Sant's Jerry at one point, and he fucking sat down and watched it with his girlfriend, and they're no longer together now. I don't think it's because of that, but at the same time,
you can't disprove.
He still to this day tells me fuck you, and he watches weird shit. But Jerry was one of those movies that he was like, "What are you doing? Why am I watching this? It's fucking terrible." But I still enjoyed it because it was the experience. I had never seen anything like that, and that applies to Upstream Color. It's a film that, although you could possibly draw certain threads to other films, especially the films of Terrence Malick. I mean, if we look at it, he's probably a reference because of the whole transcendental nature of it. What we were talking about off air, how, he uses Walden and Thoreau essentially in Upstream Color as not necessarily the basis. I remember hearing an interview with Carruth. One of the reasons why he chose Walden was because he found it so boring when he was studying it. He figured that if ever anybody was using something to hypnotize someone with, it would be that, because it would be easy.
Wow.
And
that's amazing.
Thought
that's totally true of my experience with fucking transcendentalism as well. It's just like a hypnotizingly dull.
I loved it. I enjoy the sheer inventiveness of transcendentalism.
I agree. That's why I like Emerson's Nature. It was
great. I love that, man.
Yeah, it's weird because it's just so vague and abstract. It's one long rolling prose about your experience, blah blah blah. Cement yourself in the blah blah blah. It's really not supposed to be taken quite literally, but at the same time, he's attempting to take it literally, even though it feels like he's just rhyming shit off from the top of his head and putting it to paper, and then saying, "That's how I feel, man. That's the way you should live." Yeah. It makes its point, It's definitely it's supposed to be experienced like that, but it's, at the same time, the difference between just reading it leisurely and trying to go to university and you're studying it, it's a different ball game, man. People sitting you down and trying to make heads or tails of transcendentalism in fucking essays and shit like that, like you have to use it for concrete essay writing.
Yeah.
Disastrous and exhausting and hypnotizingly dull.
I disagree with you, and I'll tell you why. In the collection of essays on nature, he has one called The American Scholar. And that essay was really interesting because what he does is he basically tries to, it's like a call to arms, basically, of every American scholar there is, every writer and whatnot, to ditch everything that had to do with Great Britain and how literature was written back then and all that, so that the American culture can have their own set of rules, when it comes to writing prose. And it was funny because when I was studying Shakespeare's tragedies, I actually did a transcendentalist reading of King Lear. And it was really fun because there's a lot of nature imagery in there. And I had submitted it to Bishop's University in Sherbrooke. And it was funny because there was a woman there that's a Shakespeare scholar. I won't name her. And I remember, long story short, the teacher here, Stephen Adamian, who I'm hoping I'm going to get on the show at one point so he can come talk to us about Japanese cinema. Yes. Great guy, wonderful, wonderful. Probably the best teacher I've ever had. Him and Jean-Philippe Marcoux, the other guy we wanted to possibly have on for Detroit. These guys have changed my worldview, and they're amazing guys. It's such knowledge that comes from them. And I remember Damien telling me about the essay. He was like, you know what? This is a fun gimmick. This is really cool. He says, I had never thought of that. And he says, what's funny about it is that how Emerson shaped, his essay and, nature and the oversoul and all that stuff. He says it's kind of weird because what you've just done is shown him that he didn't change anything. It's essentially...
Yeah, absolutely. It's the same shit.
And so...
starting stuff by borrowing
exactly
from the shit that's come from before.
So it's like, Emerson was sort of like, the American Tarantino, where he's just borrowing shit from the British to construct his own philosophy.
Remixing it.
And it was really funny because I remember sending it in and I was accepted into the conference where I was going to go present the essay. But the woman who's in charge of the conference says, you need to heavily rewrite this because it feels as though you just found a gimmick and applied it. And I wrote back a message and says, that's exactly what I did. And she says, but what are we going to gain from it? I says, well, you gain the fact that Emerson was full of shit, a little. And I'm not taking anything away from him, but she says, well, that's not good enough.
You should take a little bit away from him.
But at the same time, it didn't matter. I mean, here I wasn't puffing my chest anyway. So I sent an email back and this blew up in my face. I sent an email back where I says, well, you know what? I can't make it that weekend because the Formula One season is starting, so I'll stay home. And Jean-Philippe Marcoux said, you know what? He says, you were accepted into that conference, and that was really good for Laval University. And you shitting the bed like that makes us look really bad. And I was like, oh shit, well, I'm really, really sorry, but she was condescending to me, and I didn't really give a shit. And so I decided, fuck the conference. But it's because I had presented it.
You had to you scar the internet for one dude that you kind of half shared a viewpoint with, and then host your own show so that you couldn't possibly have to deal with the shit of people taking your word but then ignoring it on the basis of some nonsense, which is totally it's total bullshit. Though I mean, that was nonsense. Like they like it enough that they feel it needs to be represented.
Yeah.
But at the same time,
I have to change it.
It has to tick a certain box to be read out loud.
Exactly.
Like, what the fuck?
It was weird.
It clearly made the impression. Surely that was enough.
Yeah, but it's funny because I was like, "Fuck this! Why do I don't feel like rewriting what I wrote? It doesn't need a revision. Yeah. You write it. You take my shit and you write whatever the hell you have to say about it. I said what I have to say about it. I'm moving on now. I'm moving on to something else. So it was kind of fun. It was kind of fun to have that whole transcendentalist aspect kind of show up in Upstream Color again, where I'm like, this will be interesting because you definitely get that Malick vibe, not only from Ghost Story we were talking about, but also in Upstream Color, where the idea of really using nature imagery in order to convey specific messages, And I think that Carruth in this one, it was kind of fun, but I don't think he's using it in the appropriate way or the way that Emerson intended. I think what he's pointing to is just how full of shit Emerson was, in a way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's the thing. When I initially watched the film, I thought it was maybe like an interpretation of like transcendentalism in like an urban society, a modern society. How applicable is it? And I was kind of looking at that last year, and I watched it again this year. And what you're saying, that it's kind of like a fuck you to Emerson and that movement, that I totally got. Because the sort of overarching idea in transcendentalism is that this connecting with nature brings about a sense of purity or divinity.
Yeah.
That you basically, the closer to it you get, the closer you get to God.
Exactly, yeah. It's basically, I'll quote my teacher, Marcoux, who said basically it's your projection of yourself onto nature will get you that higher connection to a deity of sorts, the oversoul. He doesn't call him God specifically, but he calls him the oversoul. Everyone's connected in the oversoul. So yeah, sorry, keep going, man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's exactly that. But when you kind of piece together what else is going on in the narrative, man. And that's what I did this time around, it very much felt like, yes, there's nature there, maybe in a distracting way for some people, maybe to upend the system. but it didn't feel like, it felt like Transcendentalism was there in name, but not in spirit, you know. And when I was thinking about, initially a year ago, when I was thinking about like how the pigs sort of rot to the ground, and then they become this sort of blue essence that climbs into the trees, and that all has some sort of mental link to the characters in this story, and also a very physical link to the characters in that story. I was thinking, oh well, that's like Transcendentalism, because nature is in all of us, you know, and kind of with like airy fairy kind of interpretations like that. I guess, but like the actual what happens with that nature to the characters, and how essentially that is used in the narrative, essentially upends it to suggest that it is almost the exact opposite of divinity and purity that's being taken here, you know? Or if it is purity, it's being abused along the lines to manipulate people.
Yeah.
It's like a very broad oversight of what the story felt like to me.
And it's interesting because, you know, it could be an encapsulation of U.S. history and, you know, its relationship to philosophy. If you look at how, like, Puritanism, when it came to the United States, like, nature is evil. It will fuck you up and you need to defeat it in a way, you know? And so, I mean, when you have these connecting dots where you go back to the early 1600s when the Puritans came over, and you know, they have this philosophy of like, where we have to charge into nature because there's something evil lurking there. And now with Emerson in like 1836, I think when nature came out, he basically says, no, nature is our ally. We have to go out there, and that's where we're going to find each other. You know, we're going to find ourselves as well. And I think that, like, through the years with these philosophies that have just been compounded, and new religions and Catholicism, and now we're heading over to capitalism, the idea that these two characters, Chris and Jeff, feeling lost seems appropriate, you know, because they don't know where to look anymore. Basically, it's like, well, nature doesn't seem okay because now I've been trapped in this whole capitalist
I've been fucked
landscape.
over by nature.
Exactly.
Specifically, nature has fucked me over. You know?
Yeah, nature can be used to do evil shit. I mean, the guy's getting worms and plants and whatnot, and basically
it takes your life from you.
Yeah, and I mean, it's the same thing that we were talking. Like, we could basically say, like, you know, even pharmaceuticals, not all of them are chemicals. There's some of them are going to be plant based that they can use, that are going to be used as narcotics to actually help people heal. But at this time, you have this one guy that's basically saying, oh, you know, those pills that are supposed to be good for you? Well, fuck that.
Yeah.
I'm going to take advantage of you. Know? So.
It also kind of feels like a post-philosophy film.
Oh, I like that. That's nice.
Because if you look at what nature was, like and transcendentalism and nature and that connection, while it does use, you know, an essential idea of getting connected with God and this bettering yourself ideal, at the same time, this is still some dude's idea that changes people's lives. It's just another church, you know? It's just another building, and eventually down the line, like the transcendentalists were tossed aside for the next movement, just like you said, you know? And that happens, and it builds to capitalism where we are now, and that's sort of, I suppose, veering towards a secular or more secular society. But it is that connection to transcendentalism that kind of helped me see that, you know? It helped me connect that dot, and I think a lot of people who aren't really familiar with transcendentalism and its ideas probably might not pick up on that immediately.
But I mean, we're going to be steering clear from that from now on, though, because a lot of the literature that's probably out there right now, I kind of read one or two things, but they picked up on transcendentalism as well. But I mean, that's the overarching thing that's like you said, that's the door with which you can kind of step into it and kind of look at it. But I want to kind of get away from that as well, because I mean, if Carruth is actually trying to kick down these ideas and say, listen, this is all organized shit and we have to get away from it. To me, what he's trying to do is basically demonstrate that this is a deconstruction of the self through everything that may be of influence on a person's like decision making.
Absolutely.
The big question of the film, for me anyway, is what happens when all these social structures are destroyed, right? What happens when you're kind of just basically starting from scratch? You know, even if you're an adult, you know, you're going into this world, you, like even us today, when we're walking through society, this is a society that's not only shaped by our own experience, but it's also shaped by our parents' experience and their parents' experience. So we're kind of living down that vessel. It's just basically the circularity that goes throughout Upstream Color as well. So our decisions are somewhat informed by shit that we didn't have anything to do with in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the funny thing is that in a way, I kept thinking of The Matrix when I was watching Upstream Color, and how our reality is relative based on our own experience. And it's very, very weird because, I remember mentioned during Ghost Story that I thought it was like a pastoral version of Interstellar. And I think that Upstream Color could be considered a pastoral version of The Matrix. If you strip someone of their reality, Carruth seems to be saying that people are more similar than they think. If you look at just the shared memories between Chris and Jeff, they can't even figure out who did what. Their experience is boiled down to the same. Their reality becomes the same one, which is weird because when you're watching The Matrix and then Neo decides he's going to take the red pill instead of the blue pill, he's basically shifting realities. He goes from that.
He's starting a new life,
exactly,
because he knows nothing in this new one. Whereas he thought he was this guy, he was this hacker guy in the world, and he had his place set out, and he was looking for something called the Matrix. And then when he finds the Matrix, turns out he's some dude in a long line of dudes in a pod. And he's just one that's kind of aware of it.
Exactly.
And where do you go from there?
Well, that's the funny thing because, from there, when you look at it, you look at the Matrix, there are no social structures like when they're in Zion or something like that. They're just a tribe of people that are trying to get through whatever the fuck mess is happening. And I think that in Upstream Color, it's essentially the same thing. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that if we get rid of all these, the structures, the customs, the traditions, our habits, reality becomes this strange, chaotic place, to navigate if you're kind of looking for a sense of self. And if the thief teaches us anything in Upstream Color, is that social structures are very easy to navigate and easy to manipulate and much easier to control. And I think that if you apply it to today's reality, capitalism is the one the social construct that's been taking over religion, right? It's a new form of religion that's eventually going to die out like everything else. It's a weird thing. Sadly, I won't be alive to see the end of capitalism. And I'm not.
Sadly,
I'm not some weird Marxist.
Could be the end of days for everything we know.
Yeah,
sadly.
But it's a society we abide by right now. I'd love to see what the next iteration is. My grandfather kind of went from that religion into, he lived through a war and he saw the emergence of capitalism and being born in the 1920s and whatnot. It's not too far away from the Industrial Revolution, but it was still a concept that was very new. It was very, how could I put it? It was a like-minded society back then where people actually helped each other and individuality wasn't necessarily as much a thing as it is today. People are trying to make it today but they're going to make it on their own terms and they're not thinking about the greater good, and I don't want to take something from Hot Fuzz, but at the same time, that's exactly what it is. We abide by these social constructs. We work, we provide for our families, we buy shit, we go on vacation, but we're all part of the same loop until we die, and then someone picks up from where we left off.
Yeah,
and I think Upstream Color really tackles those notions. And it's weird because I feel like when I finished watching the movie, I was like, motherfucker, I know I'm brainwashed. Leave me alone. It felt like a very difficult thing to deal with.
I'm on Twitter. I know that I'm harping the same shit as everybody else. I know that it all comes from a poisonous interpretation of our identity.
Yeah.
You don't need to remind me, film.
I think that, what Carruth might be touching on, and this is me reaching again, but I think that if we look at it broadly speaking, what he's touching on is the fact that our individual identity is shaped according to an imposed capitalist mindset. You're tricked into believing that you're actually making choices, but in fact, those choices have already been made for you. And I think that echoes a little bit of the Morpheus speech in The Matrix as well, when he's pointing to the battery and he explains to Neo, this has been a carefully crafted, weird video game in which you're just one of the pieces of the puzzle. You don't really mean anything. And I think that, if you look at those certain parts of your identity that you think are kind of, who you are, if you take the thief, for example, or even the sampler, those could be representative of massive corporations like Google that sell your personal information in order to get money. They tailor advertising according to who you are as an individual. So it seems like you're making a choice, but as I said, that choice has been made for you. That's kind of like what's going on in Upstream Color, is where your projection of yourself is not necessarily who you really are. And I think that this is exactly what happens to Chris in the beginning of the film. The fact that she essentially is going through the motions of what her life actually is. And then once she's basically taken away, once that reality is taken away and she's shot back into the world with no real sense of self. I mean, she loses her job. She's still lucky that she has the house, but she abandons that not too long after. I think that she eventually moves in with Jeff. And I mean, it's just this weird deconstruction of her identity that she has to build from scratch. And I think that also applies to like organized religion, which is why I think, and I talked to you about this, why I got the impression that both Chris and Jeff, were symbolic of having emerged from this cult, and coming back into society, broken free and re-entered society, trying to make sense of a new reality. I mean, we hear these stories from Scientology and whatnot, and it's somewhat similar, the weird pains that they've gone through in order to try to reshape what reality they're living with.
And it's funny too, because it doesn't have to be akin to brainwash. That's these social structures and what your identity and what causes a collapse in that and a starting of things can be something even like rape, for example.
Okay. This just took a turn.
Yeah,
but you're right. It is a form of rape. You're absolutely right.
That's what I mean. Like, because the identity that a lot of people, rape survivors, feel is that they lost an identity or a piece of their selves.
Yeah,
it's about reconstructing what is it about you that survived. What elements of your identity live now that someone has taken something that potentially you identify with, like your sexuality. And how do you identify the world from there? And a lot of that kind of centers around this sort of big bridge term when it comes to like cults or rape or even like educational or corporate brainwashing.
All right,
all
man,
that
that's
stuff.
fair.
It feels like trauma is the word,
Good, yeah.
You must live on post something, knowing that something is missing. That absence is trauma.
Okay.
And so that interpretation then leads into how potentially the loop, while it also looks, I think you're absolutely right with the social structures, and it's very endemic of how we as a society piece together, start again, and potentially fall into the same patterns. Trauma can be, in a rehabilitation sense, can lead to something similar, and I think Carruth does kind of look at that as he pieces the film together in terms of Chris's story, her relation to Jeff, and also their shared relation to both the sampler and the thief, who all collectively are aware of trauma, and I think that's what connects them most, is that some are more aware than others. Some are aware of their own trauma. Chris and Jeff are aware of what their trauma is, or at least trying to be more aware of what their trauma is, because they don't actually know
what happened.
Like the brainwashing thing, they don't know how or why it happened. They just know it's gone, or they're living past it.
Right.
And they're trying to piece it together collectively, and that's like rehabilitation.
Yeah.
But when you look at the sampler, he's somebody who's aware of others' trauma, because his connection with the pigs themselves, he can get near them, and he can see the people living their lives, and all of them containing the parasite that he has taken from them.
Right.
So in that sense, the sampler might seem something like a counselor, like a trauma counselor, or somebody who tries to help, in a way, try to build or piece together those, or help those who have undergone a traumatic event.
Okay.
And then the thief is someone who's aware of trauma and abuses it. Actually takes the elements that people are missing and interprets it in a way that they can take it again from people.
Right.
And so, and it's weird, because that's drawing here, there, everywhere across the script. So like I can piece that together, and hopefully as we discuss it, I'll be able to try and piece together the certain elements that I think kind of leads to that interpretation. But the social structure thing, the great vagueness of the story is that a lot of things fit this glove.
Oh, yeah.
But it's that loss and that rebuild feels like it's centered around characters attempting to deal with trauma.
I like your idea of trauma. It feels a little bit weird to me because it seems so negative. And I understand that when you're watching Upstream Color, you do have that negative vibe. Because
it is about somebody getting brainwashed and trying to keep their life
together. But I think that, what for me anyway, the way that Carruth is trying to communicate this is that by breaking a human person down to the bare essentials, to me this looks like a quest for human connection. If you boil it down to its purest form, separate from the outside factors, economy, societal pressures, social structures, we were talking about that, which like in the end, all we have is ourselves or each other. You know what I mean? And I think that when you're talking about people trying to reconnect constantly with things, I need to reconnect with nature. I'm going to go out for a walk, or I'm going to reconnect with who I am as a person, you know, so I'll bake a cake. I have no idea what people do. You know, to me, when I reconnect with something is basically staying off social media. Just beside
watching Star Wars.
Well, you know what? That was my first idea. That's the thing that came to mind. Like last night when I went to bed after chatting on Twitter, I was like, I need to clean this motherfucking shit up. So I just put on The Force Awakens for like the 50th time. And it was great. I had a great time watching it. But I think that the idea of human connection in Upstream Color could be through trauma. But at the same time, I think that trauma doesn't necessarily have to be the world. I think it could be through common experience, because that's usually what brings people together, is common experience, whether it is trauma or something positive, right?
I get that's absolutely. I mean, when I say the word trauma, we immediately take our brains to like the worst case scenario, and a lot of the examples, like
post-traumatic stress disorder has done a job, man.
Brainwashing, those are pretty traumatic experiences, ding. And when people think of like collective trauma, which I'll talk about later, we're thinking like the Holocaust or 9/11, these big grieving experiences, between people that affects a whole nation. So because of that, and we associate that with the word trauma, that immediately we've got this huge absence of good, but in its actual objective form, the word trauma just means a sort of a missing piece that you're trying to fill, and that really is just the loss of something.
Yeah.
It can be as small or as big as, I mean, you lose something through adolescence. You lose something from going to school.
Yeah.
You lose something when you drink milk instead of water one day and you realize you hate water.
You lose something by listening to this shit.
Yeah, exactly. Like time of your life, and you'll never get it back. There's you'll always wonder why. And you'll be in a post-time lost world. That's traumatic to people, That is what trauma is. Every life is dealing with trauma, small and big.
Right.
That's what I mean. What the film focuses on. It's ambivalent more than negative. It's really just a neutral term. It's a neutral experience with negatives and positives in the connection, in the positive, the negative, in the brainwashing. But generally, it's life. It's a big cycle of ups and downs.
And do you feel that the movie ends on a positive note?
The movie ends on a total zero neutral because it's a circle.
Exactly. Okay, so
it goes back to negative, so it has to go to middle ground, and it's about that almost kind of like reconnection with yourself.
Yeah.
Or at least finally piecing together what you think you need in life. But the same thing, what happens is it starts again. And it might not happen to you, might happen to you. Doesn't really matter.
But we'll get into that a little bit later, because I disagree with you. Because we were talking about this. I disagree, but it's going to be fun to disagree. Because I saw something, and we'll be able to point it out a little bit later. Because I do think it finishes on a positive note, because I think that Carruth's main message is like, you're going to have to disconnect at one point. You're going to have to make way for something new. These social structures are not something that you're supposed to give into, and you're supposed to shape yourself according to how you feel with like the people around you, maybe reconnecting with nature, positive or negative, depending on how it is. But you're going to have to crawl through the mud in order to be reborn into something that you can call a person. Not just someone who's part of this fucking machine. And so I think that would be kind of a fun way to look at it. It's a fucked up, twisted way to end the film, but at the same time, it's cool. I was like, okay, woof. There's a sigh of relief that comes in the end of the film for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. For where Chris is at the end of the film, it's positive for her. And I think even though there is obviously something, like, never going to get back what she got. So, and we have stories that we expect people to just win the day and feel true catharsis, and that they have overcome a great deal and monster. This is potentially one of the most real stories of all time, where you end different, just different.
Yeah.
You're not better nor worse, you're just a different person who might just be happy in a different way.
Yeah, there's no romance in this, in a way.
No,
even the romance, even the scene where there is some romantic attachment, you can tell that it's awkward, it feels a little bit forced,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of funny, because even at the end of the film, most films would have actually wanted to have that more romantic end where you're like, oh, look, they're finally going to be okay. And you're spot on by saying this has nothing to do with them being okay. It just says this is where we are in the story now. Let's see where it goes, you know?
Exactly.
That's positive for me. After watching that fucking movie, that's a really positive way to look at it.
I lived a traumatic life. I'm just happy to see people live.
Bring me my pigs. I want to cuddle my pigs.
PTSD has never faded. I shake nightly.
All right, cool. So,
and so, I mean, if we wanted to get into the loop of what I mean by trauma, I mean, we both already explained the sort of the break-off point where the brainwashing kicks in.
Right.
And Chris is abused, starved, robbed. And we can see that, you know, essentially she starts the film as one person and after the brainwashing becomes someone else, you know, somebody who lacks an identity, and that life that she had before. Somebody shaken to the core who has to kind of piece things together. And I mean, the thing about that traumatic experience is that this connects Chris to a chain of the abused. And as I've already said, that's Jeff, the sampler, and more tangentially, the thief. And it's sort of interesting because that suggests they're all, as I was saying, already aware of trauma. And I'd like to define where they fall in that. Because we have Chris and Jeff, they both clearly went through the same thing. And so there's a hint that this is kind of collective trauma and that this is like their shared experience. And there's that thing where people who go through one thing, that's why we have AA meetings.
That's a good point.
And those meetups that help people discuss with like-minded or like-experienced people. And we tend to hoard with people like that. You know, we tend to form communities and relationships based on shared experience. Like, you know, the same will be, those are big things. Like, you know, you go through drug abuse or
could
you know,
be
sexual
fantasy
abuse.
football,
You meet up with
man.
people. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean. It could be school. You know, your friends that you have today, you might not all have all the same friends because the experience wasn't as shared as completely. But a lot of the friends that I still have today, and I mean, I say a lot, I mean like 2, I met in school, you know?
Yeah.
And that's because we had that shared experience and we went through a lot of the same things, we'll have that. You know, we'll always have that, even if we go different ways.
Right.
But a lot of what was post-school for us was that rehabilitation of sticking together and bitching about school to get over it and move on with our lives because we hated it, you know? So, I mean, and that's potentially the widest traumatic experience of all time. It's like, I went to school, I had a good education, and it was really bad. But it's true, though. I mean, it's, again, that trauma is a broad term. It's not, it doesn't always mean big absence in your life. And it's interesting then to expand that to the sampler, because I feel like his ability to comfort the pigs and understand their trauma, you know, when we see that experience of that man lose his wife while the sampler is looking after the pig, you know, he's touching the pig and we see that this wife cannot connect with this husband who's clearly went through something of a similar traumatic experience as Chris and Jeff. We're seeing that in a reaction to that, the sampler feeds the pig and comforts it for the day. He sits out with the pig and he looks after it for the day. So that's interesting to me because it paints the sampler as somebody who is both aware of trauma, aware of the trauma that these people are suffering, and also in relation to the pigs, he is careful to look after that trauma. You know, he's careful to nourish it and he keeps the pigs safe from harm. But he's not harming them, essentially. Mm-hmm. He will harm them in a different way later in the film, but when he realizes that someone's going through something bad, he picks them up and looks after them. And that's why I say that the sampler is something of a counselor. And I mean counselor in a broad term, as well as, like I say, trauma, because, you know, a counselor at an AA meeting, that's a guy who conducts the AA meeting. But a counselor, if we're just talking about school, a counselor could be, I don't know, your parents. Someone who's been through an experience similar to yours and has enough experience past that life that they can help guide you through your trauma. So that paints a picture of this kind of teacher as such, someone that you can depend on to guide you in a way. But interestingly, and school's a good block there, is because if it's a teacher, we already see that if those two are related, then we're kind of already starting the cycle or painting the cycle in a similar direction. And that kind of ties into what you were saying about how society starts again, how your parents interpret what their parents say and what they said, and then that becomes your identity. Essentially, you start getting fed by people who have been through the same things in the same ways, and that's not necessarily a good nor bad thing, but it also leads to its own issues.
Right.
In which your identity is then being carved by somebody else, even tangentially, someone you might not say is right next to each other. And you would see that, like, Chris and Jeff aren't even, like, related. They don't know the sampler. They haven't seen him, bar the time that he actively helps them through the worst of their trauma by taking out the parasite from them and putting it into the pig.
Right.
He does help them, but he's at that same point now, he's taking on a role of walking them through trauma, or monitoring the trauma itself and trying to define it within the pig. And in that sense, then he becomes more of an invasive role, even when he's not actually with them. He's looking after that part of them.
Right. And now that's where I want to chime in. Because if we're breaking this down in terms of structures, social structures, okay, this one represents religion at its most basic. The sampler for me was God. He's a guy who creates sounds, the sounds that populate our environment and whatnot. And I think that you pointed it out right there in terms of a counselor, as a teacher. He's not necessarily going to really take care of us, but he is this omnipresent thing that's going to take care of a part of our soul. Essentially, that worm at the core, that they have, essentially, is going to be injected into these pigs. He can overlook these pigs because it's something he can control. But at the same time, on the outside, he's this overseer. If you look at, the connection that he has, if I look at the thief is a priest. If I want to break it down in terms of religious terms.
Yeah.
It's a priestess, like if you go back to the 50s, priests were in control. They forced belief onto people. You were supposed to act a certain way. And it was a forced indoctrination, the same way as that pill is being forced down Chris's throat. Chris, by the way, is very, if she goes through a resurrection, we've got a Christ somewhere in there if we're looking for a homophone in terms of the name, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea that she is going to have to be in charge of her own destiny at one point, where completely separate from God as the sampler, who essentially, once he's done with the pigs, just gets rid of them. The guy has made his money. The thief has made his money. The priest has been paid. God has been paid. The church has been upheld to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. And then after that, what are you left with? Nothing. You have no sense of self. You're only indoctrinated to believe a certain thing that was imposed on you. And I think that the sampler in here is not a benevolent man. He is one of the assholes. And I wanted to just touch in on what you were talking about in terms of the pigs, because it was a fun conversation that we had, because the pig symbolism is something that we had argued a little bit about offline. And I wanted to bring the question that we were talking about here onto the show so that we can actually debate it. And when I was looking into the symbolism of the pig, and this was last minute because we had nothing. and so I decided to start looking at like pig worship, which is a weird thing, but Buddhism,
also hilariously a real thing.
Exactly. And that's it. So, I mean, in Buddhism, the pig is considered to be a representation of the thoughts of the true self in nature.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Or the nature of life. And so how, it also, like sows, they are considered really good mothers. So Chris, at the end of the film, for me, and this is the touching point that we had on, is actually breaking the cycle. I said if she was breaking the cycle, the loop that you were talking about just a little bit before, and liberating the pigs and taking care of them, this makes her the great mother who oversees, the protection of the people who were inflicted with that same experience that she had.
Yeah.
Her killing the sampler breaks that cycle. It's a symbolic killing of God, which is weird if you want to break it down that way. And even if Chris can't have kids of her own, she becomes the representation of that mother nature, if you will, in a sense where she restores some form of homeostasis.
Uh-huh.
She's going to complete her own loop. Okay. So I think that if you look on the other side of things with pigs, usually, if we have them in different forms in different religions, meaning something different. But on our side, in the Western hemisphere, pigs are symbols of greed.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you just look at Pink Floyd, if you look at animals, what is the biggest giant? It's a fucking pig, So he's calling the society of corporate capitalist fucks giant pigs. They're symbols of greed. And I think that these three guys, you'll have the thief, the sampler, and I don't know what the other name is. I think it was the forager, was the person that actually gets the plants.
Yes, right.
They all seek to make money off of nature.
Yeah.
Not only just nature as a representation of where we go, but also human nature. The idea that we are usually wandering lost, like these sheep or these pigs or whatever, and we need some form of guidance.
Yeah.
And so I think that Chris does break the cycle, because if the thief can't find the worms in the plants anymore, then there's nobody being drugged anymore. That means the pig farm is going to be safe. And I think that there is a scene in the film where he's actually looking for the blue on the leaves, and he keeps seeing shake the head towards the camera.
I agree.
And so he's basically left empty-handed. And so I think that sampler is a fucking asshole too, because he acts as if he's benevolent, but when he gets shot, that to me was a symbolic killing of whatever weird indoctrination there is going on in society today. So I just wanted to touch back on that.
I think that's absolutely interesting. But I also, there are bits of it that I feel don't exactly line up for me.
Okay, cool. Yeah, go ahead.
With the God idea, if we're taking this as a religious structure, I would say...
Well, I'm saying overarching deity of some sort.
I would say, I would imagine God was something more like what remains. So I guess that might be in the parasite rather than the sampler.
All right.
This sort of thing that you kind of try to keep even, and that connects with you even after the traumatic loss of your religious indoctrination. God, you might never get rid of it quite, or you might try to reclaim it. It still lives on. So it's in this pig, and there's this person who looks over it. Again, it's not a priest then. In this case, the sampler is the person who gets you past that religious breakout, but then informs you about how, or tries to re-inform you about how the world works post your break, So I feel like that would be different to me. And when it comes...
But does he help them, really?
That's what I mean. It's not help.
He leaves them on the side of the road, man.
It's it's difficult. It's not clear cut. He's not...
Okay.
He's not a straight up villain. He does do things that aren't always in the best interest of the pigs, or the people connected to the pigs, And that's because he's his own person with his own trauma. In my interpretation, he's his own person with his own trauma, looking after these pigs. And that eventually comes in that he starts seeing things in other people's trauma that he's trying to steer one direction or another. And that's kind of like how your parents, when you start questioning the worldview that they give you, once they teach you beyond, what you start with as a baby, which is nothing. Once you question that, they'll start pushing hard against it. They'll push against what you're trying to see in the world, because it doesn't fall in line with what they see in the world. Same with teachers. They'll try to keep you as close to the path as possible, close to their path as possible. But you might see things differently, and you'll try and reinterpret things of your own as you go along, and that has to be a part of the process. So I feel like the sampler is someone in that position, somebody who's there to be rigid, something to push your ideas against, but someone that you ultimately have to overcome to become something of your own person. I feel then that applies to the ending a little, which I'll go into further detail, but I don't see this as a break in the chain. I see this as the next thing. I
agree with you that it's Chris starting the cycle again, but at the same time, I started thinking about the number for the concept of pi. That there's no real circle in life.
Yeah.
Right? The idea that we have these loops are, yes, of course, we can physically make a loop and it's going to be okay. But, we're talking about circumference and whatnot. But if we're looking at it in terms of, we were talking about an omega point when we were talking about Magnolia, I feel like this is wwhere we end on the film, whereas there's this omega point, there's this spiral of things that are going to...
That's exactly the shape. Spiral. That is the best way to...
Okay.
Because it's not a complete 360, but it's an incremental change that keeps a circle shape, but eventually progresses downwards, restarts itself, and then continues, so it does move in a direction.
Okay, I see what you're saying. You're saying essentially that it's a breaking of a previous loop, but it's still a loop. She breaks the cycle, but at the same time, she's starting a new one. So yes, there is that circularity that starts, but it's on a different cog.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. I like that. That makes sense to me.
Great.
Cool. I'm willing to not stop fighting now.
See, that's the thing, though. By bouncing ideas, we can zero in on what the fuck I'm trying to say and what you're trying to say. Yeah, right. So, I mean, the connection between Jeff and Chris is rehabilitation, and I guess it also is interesting in that because they don't one-to-one see each other, we could even touch on what I was talking about with a ghost story, that people rehabilitate differently with regards to grief. Trauma, obviously, tangentially related, but not exactly the same thing. It seems that way with regards to their relationship, because there's a disconnect in what they're trying to say with each other, but at the same time, they are on the same page, you know, they can hold the relationship together based on that joint experience. But regardless, the turn of the story comes when Chris finds out she's pregnant, and then we're getting into that pig imagery that you've
I like
went
that
into.
idea.
And I mean, this is really great. This is when the story takes on a real hard turn into abstract interpretation.
Yeah, this becomes science fiction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to best explain the parasite and the pigs and that connection, best image to talk about is maybe the purity idea from the Transcendentalism. That sense of that essential bit of identity that you lose through the trauma. The way I try to see it is that the parasites are the process by which purity is taken, and the vessel which supposedly contains that purity afterwards, or symbolically, you know, and that's why I was talking about how the farmer looks after the trauma. That's essentially what I mean by purity. It's that essential fragment of yourself. You have a vague outline of what it is, but it's not something you can physically recapture again. It's gone. The pigs act then as a vessel for the parasite, and so the pig becomes symbolic of what was taken from the victims. I feel that does kind of tie into what you're saying about how that Hinduism look on the pigs as the sort of nurturing of the minds of people kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That's interesting, because I feel like the parasite ties how they garner this parasite within them, and they host it on behalf of the people. It does tie into that imagery a little bit, so I think that's very interesting, and maybe that Carruth was actually looking into that a little. Or he just got lucky. Or was going for greed.
I mean, when I'm looking at the worm, I think that the worm inside the body is the exploration of, the foundation of the self. You know, it starts as this single cell.
Yeah.
He's very careful to use this very interior versus exterior imagery, you know, and I thought it was really cool because, like, it starts off as that single cell, but then as a fully formed organism, it acts kind of like an umbilical cord. When the sampler is actually pulling it out of Chris and putting it into the pig, you can see him kind of yank at it. Now, truth be told, I've witnessed births and they don't yank at anything. They just kind of let things happen. And so I really thought that, you know, it kind of did look like he was trying to cut some sort of umbilical cord. There is that imagery there. The worm, you know, there is a mirror imagery with what you're talking about in terms of the worm and Chris swimming in the pool, right? You have that worm kind of going through the vessel, and
that's her at her most connected with the lost part of her, because then she's kind of reliving the trauma. So there's definitely a connection there with the imagery, with the motion, and with what she's even saying there. It's trying to reconnect there, and that kind of, to me, that was kind of like rehabilitatory. The discussion, you know, it was kind of when you lose the trauma, you try to remember what it was that you lost, what went through, how you lost it, try to own the trauma, you know, and that to me was her submerging herself in it, literally in the waters of her own trauma.
I love that. That's a really good way to look at it. And I mean, the picking up of the rocks, you know,
the fragments,
piecing yourself together, picking those fragments off the bottom of the pond or the pool. Sorry, pond is a reference to Thoreau, because even in Walden, it's Walden Pond, right? And so you have this idea that water is this one big thing that Thoreau is surrounded by.
Yeah.
While he was there at Walden Pond. So it still ties into transcendentalism a little bit, but at the same time,
he freezes in here, but if this continues to have better loops than we could ever grasp, it's fucking hilarious. So I mean, when the pigs represent Chris and Jeff's taken trauma, when that trauma connects as close as it can, and essentially the pigs themselves become intimate, it becomes this own different thing. And it becomes sort of the piglets then kind of like the offshoot of the trauma. Almost like there's a tangential key there into rehabilitation that actually doesn't let you regather exactly what you lost, but you get the best elements of the trauma and that takes on a life of its own. Okay?
Okay. Yeah.
So, symbolically, though, it could represent Chris's inability to have children, suggesting that symbolically it was really cancer that took away her life, that her previous life, that trauma was from her having cancer, and that the thief is imagery of which we can understand cancer. He's not supposed to be a literal character, but more symbolic of the traumatic event, which was Chris had cancer, and she couldn't go, she lost her job, she lost her savings, she lost her identity and life beforehand. That trauma for her, if we wanted to nail down where in the narrative it was, of what it was, or what shape it took, it was actually cancer, as we get later on in the dialogue about her being unable to have children. She really did, and that was the interpretation of the thief. What stole her identity from her was cancer.
Yeah.
Similarly, Jeff lost his marriage. That's far more open. Because we didn't spend time with Jeff, because we don't really get a significant time with Jeff, it's a little more iffy. It's just really a number of things with what his trauma could be. Because we still know he went through a similar thing with the money and and his loss of job. But, I mean, that could be substance abuse, alcoholism, anything.
We kind of get the impression that the reason why his marriage failed is because he was caught stealing money.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but that's the financial way, and how Chris loses her identity as well suggests that finance is just a part of that. And so it might not have been specifically the money that we lost. The money could just be another symptom of, he could have had cancer himself. He could have, if they share this trauma, it could be the exact same thing. So it could just be cancer on both ends. But it could be something very similar that took their lives from them.
And are you saying that cancer, literally, or is this cancer as a catch-all term for like?
No, I mean quite literally. That was this for these characters specifically in narrative. Chris had cancer, and that's what the form that the thief took.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by that. The piglets then are born out of that shared rehabilitation, and here's where the sort of negative side of his character comes into play. Because of his drowning of the piglets, we have to look at him as this figure, this teacher, this counselor, where the limit is when it comes to rehabilitation, where the wall is set up by these figures and how they can take us so far and then ultimately stop us from making the final plunge into really capturing our identity in a healthy post-traumatic way. And that's not to say that, this is a film denouncing that role in people's lives. But I mean, I think that what Carruth is trying to say is that often this is what happens. You can come to a rehabilitatory breakthrough that will be taken from you by the people who are trying to get you there, And ultimately, this is something that they might do it by accident. It's not necessarily, it could be just a simple, neutral thing that they don't see that as rehabilitation, and therefore they stop it. I mean, if they think that parasite, if we think the sampler thinks the parasite might be transferred to the piglets, he doesn't want them to grow up. Under that, this could be something that he feels isn't healthy for those piglets, and, therefore it devalues their lives, so he, in his head, is doing them a favor, You could interpret it that way. Or you can interpret it that he's actively preventing these people from making a breakthrough with their rehabilitation. I mean, that's wide open. I like that idea. Yeah, so, well, of course you hate him.
Indeed I do.
But and I think that's really interesting then, because we'll get to it, but that ties into very clearly where I think the mantle is taken by Chris at the end of the film. But those piglets then, they're drowned in the water, the blue dye goes into the orchids, and the original aggressor, the thief, makes the brainwashing drug inevitably out of that, there's the forager, but the thief combined, these people take essentially the purity of a breakthrough and warp it and weaponize it. And that's kind of in this spiral, in the circle, where the downfall of these social structures, or the downfall of breakthroughs and trauma come in, is that we could see it as stigma, we could see it as grounds that we can't recover again, or we could see it as an actively antagonistic element to society that even when society moves on, as I feel this spiral does, these elements find a way to reuse the new rehabilitatory essence of what was pure about the breakthrough and turn it against us. So, I mean, essentially, what we're looking at is people who actively go out of their way to hurt people.
Yeah, but isn't it a form of denying free will?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to look at it in the religious brainwashing sort of perspective, it becomes these people who fight to control people again. If we look at the cancer angle, that's harder to define what exactly the essence of the breakthrough from cancer is, you know, like, but ultimately it could be something like
it's life that goes on.
Yeah, hope. It could be them using hope and turning it against people.
I like that. That's good.
So it's really open, very open to the interpretation of the viewer and the structure that you're trying to piece together. But essentially, the important thing is that essence is being weaponized in some shape or form by these people. And what's interesting then is that when Chris takes control of her trauma at last, and kills the sampler, and that's the final act in the film, it makes sense to see it as the breaking of the chain, because it is the circle has been broken, but the spiral continues.
Yes.
The sampler, the way I like to see it is, imagine, fucking God forbid, you lose a child to murder, or lose a loved one to murder. You know the justice you feel when you see the person who murdered your child go to jail?
I'd rather not picture that, but I'll understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, think of cancer even, Imagine, you break through in cancer in general, It feels like that what defined cancer by that point in time no longer exists. Because you've finally defeated it. Is cancer gone? If we look at cancer, because there's going to be a new cancer. There's always, the way diseases work, there's always a cancer of some, it takes a different name for every iterative generation, but there's always cancer. That cancer that though, could be wiped out. We could cure cancer. Absolutely. And hopefully will very soon. That's what Chris does. She helps in a different direction beat cancer, and then becomes, by defeating the sampler, becomes someone who takes on that role in society, who helps those who have gone through the cancer that she's gone through and taken the steps that she's taken, and ultimately she's gotten rid not of cancer but of the person who identified cancer as what she got over, when really it was her own experience. It was something different, and that experience that was being related to is something slightly different. So, essentially, it's almost like saying you outlive your parents.
Okay, I like that.
You outlive your parents, and you outlive their worldview, and you develop your own, eventually when they leave you in this world, based on what iterative changes you've made from their parenting, And then you'll go on to raise your own children, and you'll teach them what you learned, and then they'll start the same system where they'll rebel at some point. And then they'll make their own changes, and then you'll die, and then they'll take over, and and that's where the spiral comes in. And that's what's interesting. So when Chris takes over this pig farm with all these people that are around her to help her, we don't know that the sampler was alone when he started the pig farm. We don't even know if he was the start of the pig farm. He could have just been taking it over himself. But he's the last one left. And ultimately, that means he's the guiding voice for all this trauma. For all these people's trauma, he is this message for these people. These pigs. And ultimately, with him gone, someone fills that role. And it makes sense that it's Chris. Because if the trauma the rehabilitatory loss in the pig farm was the piglets for the sampler, Chris is the one who's going to want to change that. But Chris has her own bias. Maybe she doesn't like hooves.
Okay.
Maybe she doesn't like mud. Sense. Maybe she doesn't like pigs getting to a certain age. Maybe she feels like pigs should be in a smaller pen so they're safer together. Maybe she feels that because her piglets were taken from her, there should be way more piglets. Too many,
Right.
Ultimately, the trauma evolves, but it's a different trauma, It's still a problem. And the thing is, essentially, that what I feel is, if that's the response she takes, pigs will die. And she'll probably dispose of them in a river. It might not be the same river.
But she's not alone, man. At the end of the film. No. But she brings those people.
That's what I mean, though. That's what's interesting. At the end of the film, we get that respite of relief that you get when you see justice, When you carve your identity for yourself and you finally made it to who this different person is, the trauma is under your control. You now have that pig, you now know what the trauma is. You had to get rid of the other voices, and you invite people in to discuss what the trauma is, even when you get that farm,
Right.
But, as with the sampler, that could have been the same story. He could have done the exact same thing. Had it came a bunch of people, then became this definitive voice, because his trauma was his and it was bigger and stronger than the rest. And he goes out of his way to look after these pigs. And maybe everybody else is gone by that point. Or maybe the shared community combines themselves to become a legion of voices of which to help people in their trauma for the future, you know? And then that's the iterative shape that takes, that there's more than one sampler going forward. But Chris is definitely one of them, is the point. Chris is somebody who is that person who has their defined worldview. And going forward, when dealing with the farm, whatever way they dispose of or tackle the issue, there's an opposite issue that develops post-film. Now, at the film end, we're happy. But as with life, you die, you know, and Chris is going to die too.
Yeah.
And Chris is probably going to get killed by, you know, somebody else who comes for their trauma. If she's a parent, somebody's going to come for her, you know. If she's
right.
She's a cancer survivor, somebody's going to outlive her. The death is a symbolic one, not a physical one. The sampler doesn't die. His role as the sampler is dead. So Chris then becomes part of this communo-sampler, and however they deal with the trauma that these pigs then inhibit, it's more than likely that they realize that they're just going to keep on taking parasites and putting them in the pigs because it helped her in the initial phase, and she feels that was a good part.
Oh, okay.
That helped her rehabilitate, you know? That was a positive thing that helped her. She got rid of the trauma in its initial form, and the sampler was, even if it was for his pigs, he didn't really have anything to gain. We never see him get any gains from the fact that these pigs have parasites, so we have to assume it's benevolent. It's somebody's going out of their way
I don't
to
know,
help
man.
them.
I think that I thought he was just using them to record sounds, to be honest.
Maybe. I mean, absolutely. There's always that aspect that
There
you
was a
could
purpose
get
for me
something
that
from
he was-
helping people. I mean, altruism doesn't exist, in my view. So, this guy, he could be helping people for the right reasons and getting a little something out of it for himself. Maybe financial. If he's a counselor, he gets paid, doesn't he? So, I mean, there are these factors. Nothing is clear cut. Nothing is so simple as there are good and bad. But ultimately, this trauma repeats itself. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe that version of the thief is dead. You know, his career is gone.
Right.
That life. But there will be a different thief in a different form. Because these pigs die, inevitably. And they rot. And that essence in the parasite is still going to get to the earth, no matter where they go. It doesn't have to be to a river. Can go for a tree, can go for the ground, can go for the dirt, can make up into flowers. They'll be blue, people will pick them, and they will weaponize them, you know? The cycle is a spiral, and it continues based on the shared idea of what trauma becomes after trauma has been lived past. And so that's kind of what I saw in the film.
I have something to support that.
Yeah.
And it's in Carruth's visual language. Just the opening shot of the film.
Really? Right.
The opening shot is of trash, which is what you're talking about, essentially. It's essentially the end of a cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I mean, the idea that the trash that he's taking out are those loops. There's a circularity there as well. So there's an emphasis on the circularity given the opening shot of the rings on screen. And so everything goes through the life cycle, which is essentially what you're talking about. So we've got an interesting visual cue as to what the structure of the film's going to be like.
Yeah.
Just in that first shot. It's that signal that something has come to an end, but seeing as that it's the beginning of the film, we have our new beginning and our end in the first fucking shot of the movie.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
And
that's
so, I mean,
ingenious.
that really supports exactly what you're talking about. So I think that it's kind of a weird thing to start the movie with, because if it goes to support what you're saying as the opening shot, he's also testing the audience's ability for perception.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
The fact that he's asking you to make a choice, is this the end or is it the beginning? I have no idea. It's the end of something, clearly, because that's where trash goes.
Yeah,
It's
we
the
never.
end.
The amazing thing is we never see that image. I mean, we do see trashing of those links at the end of Chris's brainwashing, but after that point we see people make links, but we never see them getting the thief basically disappears. The trashing never happens again. We only see the thief again to note that he's been done in. It's basically his career is over as that. You know, it's the end of that particular weaponizing of trauma, you know.
We could even stipulate that the fact that he's throwing out that trash at the beginning of the film, that could have actually been the end of Jeff's cycle.
Yeah.
We have no idea. It could be implied. It's kind of weird because that's essentially what you're saying, is that we're all going to end up at the trash at one point.
Well, it's true. We all die.
And it's going to be, we're going to have to start from scratch somewhere else, no matter what it is we are.
Yeah. Well, that's essentially how trauma works, you know, in life. You'll go through it 15, 20, 50 times, you know. Small or big, you will start a separate identity for yourself. I mean, I started an identity for myself when I first met Maria, you know? I started a new identity for myself when I got married, because now I'm people will refer to me as some husband or, that sort of thing.
Belong to someone.
Exactly.
Now.
I'm no longer a boyfriend, you know? And, I started a new identity when I got cats. So now I'm a cat guy, apparently, you know? That's the kind of shit. The little trauma is that missing life before, because now I'm not a guy who didn't have cats.
Another shot that I thought was interesting is the shot of the broken windshield. At the beginning of the film, you'll have the thief that's actually putting out the trash. We'll see the two dudes that see him basically dealing drugs, and he's basically one of the guys is buying drugs from the thief so that he can make that drink. And as the thief leaves, the focus is on the windshield of the car that's actually broken. It looks like he's gotten a rock. And it's kind of funny because I think that in this case, what Carruth might actually be suggesting is that we're riding along with someone who has a broken worldview.
You think it's a reflection of Carruth himself?
I don't think it's a reflection of Carruth himself. I think it's a reflection on how people are going to abuse nature for their own gain.
Right, yeah.
That we're riding along with someone that we have to say is suspect, because if he's riding along with his broken windshield, he's not necessarily someone who likes to fix shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That makes sense. No, you're totally right. That's great.
And so if this plays into how he's an individual who takes advantage of people by brainwashing them to steal their money, I think that it's kind of funny because maybe with that broken windshield, you have this anti-capitalist stance that's not necessarily implemented in that shot, but as the movie goes along and you see that he's actually trying to take advantage of people.
Yeah.
I don't know if Carruth is trying to be like all Marxist about, this whole thing, but I'm pretty sure that there is a Marxist interpretation of Upstream color somewhere in there.
Oh, absolutely. If there's a societal discourse to be had, then there's a breaking of societal discourse to be had.
Well, I mean, just look at how, if we're going to take the anti-capitalist angle, look at how Jeff later confesses to Chris, like you were talking about, that he stole money from a company. He used to be a thief as well. That was part of a cycle that he had before. But then after that, and this is one of the things that I was like, ugh. I'm pretty sure. Anyway, this is one visual thing that I was like, this is terrible. This is amateur shit. But it doesn't matter to a certain extent. Is when he's dumping the documents from the 5th floor of the building.
Yeah, I was literally just thinking that, fuck my previous held assumptions of society. Goodbye, box of documents from my career that doesn't matter anymore.
But I mean, then he turns around and he's literally fist fighting capitalism by beating the two guys. And so that was one of the ones that I was like, it's a little on the nose.
Definitely.
But I mean, one of my favorite things about the visual language of Upstream color is what I'm going to call this is I don't know if this is going to catch on or not, is what I call the insinuation subversion, and how he presents certain images, objects, or a scene, that alters your perspective on things, that he's not necessarily committing to a subversion of itself,
absolutely.
But he's posing the possibility and saying, you can look at it this way, you can look at it this way.
It could be a little bit of both or one or the other. It's open and interpretive.
It's depending on how your identity is shaped, you'll be able to interpret certain situations in certain ways.
I think people who watch blockbusters will call that bad writing.
Possible. But I mean, it ties into transcendentalism. It basically, like, what we're taking to the movie is we project what we know onto the film, and we're going to expect something from it. Maybe not God, but at least we'll get some sort of some feedback, And I think one of the things, like what I'm talking about in terms of insinuation subversion, is the making of the pill, the one with the worm. And I think the making of the worm like really sets the audience down a weird path, because it's one where this idyllic nature, is also presented as this place where there's this weird like corruption.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
You literally have to roast a worm alive to get the juice from it, like a heroin addict.
Well, exactly. I mean, and the plant that the thief uses grows in nature, but it's used in two different manners in the film. Right? You'll have it basically for recreation, which is essentially what you're saying, to roast it in order to kind of have that little weird buzz where you're controlling your friend's body.
Yeah, exactly.
And then one for manipulation, and then you'll have the idea of a pill that's usually used to help individuals. Pharmacy, people are going to be treated for depression with pills. You just take fucking Advil, for Christ's sake, for some pain that you have in the Gulliver just to borrow some parlance from across the ocean there. You have this guy actually using it to harm.
Yeah.
Which is one of those things where you're like, okay, he's not subverting anything, but he's insinuating that there is a subversion that's there. You know, he's not saying this is what I think that the pill can be used as, but he's saying, well, look, these are options.
These things are broader than they look.
Exactly. And this is another thing that I thought was really weird because I had never seen it used this way before. And it's the valve mask that he uses. The thief uses to pump, the
worm
pill
directly
into Chris.
Into Chris. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, this is again an instance of what I'm going to call insinuation subversion. I wish there was a better term. Someone send me a better term. Where that object was specifically designed to give people air, to save people. And here it's used as a weapon to attack and drug someone.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that, like what I was touching upon a little bit earlier, the idea of this representation of indoctrination is something that's pumped into your head at a young age. And then you kind of have to come into your own at one point as some born again, so we're talking about capitalism or religion again, so I think that the idea that you have the system being pushed into you as opposed to you being sucked into the system is a really weird subversion in and of itself. The idea that maybe there's something more to it. Maybe it's not necessarily your fault. It's being forced upon you. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's another breathing apparatus in the film as well, where the sampler is actually using drugs to put the pig out, to put it to sleep.
That's right.
And I mean, that's another thing, when you say that someone is waking from this weird dream, you've had these people come out of Scientology and said that they've been awoken to certain things, so you have this waking process, that's going on. And I mean, the sampler, if I want to use my God imagery again, this is a guy who's put people to sleep in order to take advantage of them.
Absolutely.
He's basically putting the fucking worm inside the pig, and this is the thing that he can control. And I mean, if you look at it, even when the pig wakes up, he's guided towards a pen through these really narrow hallways. That's what indoctrination is. It's this one little path that you're allowed to, but there's a whole other world outside those paths that you're not allowed to see.
Yeah.
And so that pig is being guided to a specific location. I think my favorite scene in the entire film is probably one of the most complex in terms of how to interpret it, and it's the abduction scene.
Yeah, I mean, because there's a lot of imagery thrown at you, even though the action's quite simple.
Yeah, exactly. It's very weird because once the door kicks open, the shot is of an overhead shot, and then it cuts to this crab right shot.
Yeah,
where the camera's going to dolly right. Now, an over-the-head shot usually represents death or some imminent death, but it can also represent that God's watching.
Okay, yeah.
It's one of those things, when you're watching the end of a film, like a musical or something like that, they'll have that crane shot. If you look at the end of Sound of Music, that shot goes up. The end of Mary Poppins, that shot goes up. So it's basically leading you on to a different day, okay? But in movies, most of the time, you're going to use that shot as an overhead shot as the spirit leaving the body.
Yeah, right.
So it's the symbolic death of something, but it could be the beginning of something again. So we have that imagery from the first shot of the film again, where the trash is symbolic of the end of something, but maybe it's the beginning of something as well, because it's the beginning of the film.
Yeah, exactly. You're immediately getting that insinuation subversion with both life, death, and rubbish all in the same image.
Exactly.
And all these mixed signals from just the way it's framed.
Exactly. And I mean, that crab right usually is like heading towards some uncertain future, right? So I mean, in that, just those two shots, let me rephrase that because I forgot to include one crucial part of information. There's a mirror image with the beginning of the film again, because the thief takes her out into a back alley, and the back alley is usually where people throw out their trash. If you look carefully in the background, you can see garbage bins there as well. So he's also taking out the trash again. But at the same time, if we compare it to the beginning of the film, where the taking out of the trash is symbolic of the end of something and the beginning of something as well, we have that again in the abduction scene, where he's communicating all these things at the same time. What do you make of this? Is this a symbolic death? Is it a rebirth? Is it a birth that she wants? Is she part of that trash? Is the trash that she's going to be part of a new beginning for her? Is this a death of who she was, and who she's going to become is going to be birthed out of this?
Yeah, and is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or kind of thrown to the wayside? Because, like, literally the imagery is so mixed, and the action looks as bad as it gets. But because you're getting these sort of religious images, and you're getting this sort of positive stimulus from, like, just how it's presented, and especially when it comes to, as you were saying, with the breathing apparatus, this is supposed to be life, this is supposed to be a start again, so it should be a good thing, but it looks pretty bad.
And it is. It looks pretty bad. I mean, and it's raining at the same time.
Yeah.
Rain is one of those things
it's just one of those, it means a bad signs.
Yes, but at the same time, water is what gives life to nature.
Yeah. That's absolutely
and so
true. So again, this is fucking mixed
that
signals.
whole scene, exactly. The whole scene is this mix of things. It's like, what do you guys think of this? And it goes back to what you're talking about in terms of a rape scene as well, because that is essentially what it is. He's forcing himself upon her.
Very much in narrative, that's a rape scene.
And so, I mean, it's really, really a strange, like I said, when I was piecing this one together, I was like, holy fuck, there's a lot going on in that scene. And it might seem like nothing. It might seem like just an abduction. But no, if you look at the visual language that Carruth is using throughout the entire film, especially the use of water, worms, and just the imagery using the trash. Trash is so prevalent throughout the entire film. Yeah. People throw things away like you wouldn't believe. She even walks into her house at one point and there's trash all over the fucking house.
Yeah,
It's just like, what the hell's going on?
Absolutely.
And the trash bags that he uses to dump the pigs over the cliff, and so I mean, I even picked up on one of the scenes that seems to be taken out directly from Walden, and I'm going to read it. I have a quote here. Because there's a scene in the film where Chris is sitting in her backyard. She's just listening to nature. She seems to be taking it in for the first time after she's been woken up on the side of the road. And she's just kind of like, what the hell is going on? And it's really weird. So I'm going to read the passage from Thoreau. It's on page 84 for you guys who want to see it, in a chapter called Sounds. And the passage from Thoreau reads like this. Sometimes in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in reverie amidst the pines and hickories and sumacs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiseless through the house, until by the sun falling at my west window or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time. Now, what Thoreau seems to be communicating here is peace.
Yeah.
He seems to be very much at peace with what's going on, and he's just trying to take in how nature is. Mm-hmm. When you look at what's happening with Chris is taking it in a completely different way. It seems to be the exact same thing. It's like Carruth took that quote and decided to put it in visual imagery, and he's saying, well, what if she's not at peace with anything?
Yeah, it's kind of like the reverse of that exact imagery,
Exactly.
Where in Walden Thoreau becomes aware of time after the wagon arrives, and therefore that human element disturbs nature. It's at the side of the road. That's where we find Chris at first.
Find her, exactly.
So, she's coming from a place where she's been disturbed, and her first action is to try and piece it together through nature. What Carruth is saying is that, maybe that works. Maybe it works for Thoreau one way, but if you come from the other direction, you're not going to just piece yourself together. You can be made aware of time by just calming down in nature as much as you can by being awoken by a wagon, basically.
I think it points to a really interesting dichotomy between these two narratives, Upstream Color and Walden. Thoreau did this by choice.
Yeah.
And in Upstream Color, they're not doing it by choice. And so I think that what Carruth is pointing to is one of those little things that's untalked about, unmentioned, if you will.
Yeah.
Is that Thoreau did this willingly. He went into nature and he was able to find himself, and it's all really fun and games, but he didn't stay there that long, and he went back to society, and he
wrote a good book about it.
Oh, exactly. A really good book.
Really profitable.
Exactly. People are still reading it today, and it's like, this is the essence of who we are. And you're like, fuck you.
Yeah,
but at the same time, exactly. The funny thing is that it's a little hypocritical of Thoreau to say, learn from my teachings. I think that Carruth might actually be a little bit along those lines, and like, fuck your teachings. Look what can happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
It's one of those things like, I didn't have a choice. These people didn't have a choice the way that you decided to take advantage of nature the way that you were doing it. What if people are being taken advantage of using nature?
Well, I mean, that's one of those examples. Like, I mean, I know it's a film that you don't like, but the actual story that it's inspired by, Into the Wild, it's literally one of those guys, one of those guys inspired by the great transcendental figures like Thoreau, takes the meaning, and then he just goes out and lives that life. and dies. That's what happens. That's
the
that's
end of his
reality.
cycle.
You can't just do that. We build our houses to live, not to get away from nature, to survive with nature. So yeah, I think you're totally right when Carruth says, yeah, it's all well and good for you, rich guy who lived in a cabin for a couple of days, but like,
there you go. I love that. That's a right way to say it.
But yeah, it doesn't work that way. If you're just Joe Smo, you're just getting used, and ultimately you'll get fucked over by these ideologies, and that's just what happens. Common man gets fucked all the time because rich guy tells you how to feel.
And that's a great way to close out this episode. Rich guy tells you how to feel. I like that. And so that's it. I mean, but just closing thoughts and whatnot. I don't know if you had any more to say. I kind of pretty much, I think we covered a lot of what I wanted to talk about.
I know, I'm fair. I feel it's beyond the interpretation that we've presented. I feel that, like you've said, with this and Ghost Story, you bring a lot of yourself into this. Particularly, I mean, if you think of the way that I view trauma, I mean, trauma couldn't be more personal. So when you go into this and you discuss how it reminds you of potential rape discourse or something like that, or an experience like how cancer affected.
I'd love Carrie's take on rape discourse.
Yeah, being somebody knowledgeable about the discourse and where to go for that.
That'd be great.
That's a point of view worth discussing in more detail. I went for broad strokes, as I think that we kind of zeroed in on a few things when it comes to understanding these kind of bigger structures, but there's minimal structures in there as well, and maybe it's not our place to go into that because I don't know, we're privileged white guys ourselves.
Indeed we are.
But yeah, I feel discourse doesn't stop here, so I want people to watch this, and I want people to bring something of themselves to this and pick this up again somewhere, because we could be off, we could be on, we could be groundwork, whatever. We got to continue it because it's one of those films. It's one of those films that deserves it. More importantly,
and I think that you pointed out something really great at the beginning when you're talking about experiential. This is an experiential film, and I think Carruth is pointing to the fact that our senses act differently depending on where we are. Depending on we're talking about water, we're talking about land throughout this entire thing, and what grows from nature and what we can use either for good or bad. And I mean, even when I pointed out earlier that sound and touch are really important in the film, I didn't want to do that, but look at how many times people touch things in the movie.
Yeah,
you'll see hands rubbing on sheets. You'll see them rubbing on walls. You'll see people that are even at the beginning of the film, he rubs the plant leaves and whatnot. He even scrapes it with a knife. Look at how many times people are actually touching. Even the two boys at the beginning of the film, one blocks the other guy. They're actually holding hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a lot of touching going on. The sound design was really, really important to get these soundscapes that are kind of mimicking what nature would sound like, but not necessarily. You see that there's something troubled in there.
Yeah, and I think that plays into the sampler as well, and the way he manipulates nature to try to get these particular results. There's absolutely a discourse there on how even he takes advantage of nature in a different way from what the thief does, and how to sort of work that into its own interpretation. And sound design plays a huge part of that. Where it's linear notes from us.
Yeah. But I mean, look, I think that Upstream Color, what Carruth is really trying to do is to show that, depending on the experiences that you have, one's cognition of the self is going to be different depending on the experience or the variety of situations that one goes through. Look at Chris and Jeff when they come face to face. Identity-wise, they're a mirror image. And so Carruth isn't necessarily interested in the physical aspect of people, because identity comes from within. That's why we see that single-celled organism. That's why we see that worm starts to manipulate. He wants to go inside and see what makes us tick, and then kind of bring it out, kind of extract it the same way as the guy's extracting the drug from the plant, the same way as the worm is extracted from the pig, and the same way the memories are extracted from these people. And so I think that if you're going to make a case for it, this is a really, really dense film.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I would consider, I'll probably rewatch this, maybe not now, but I'm going to rewatch it because it's one of those movies that, depending on how I'm going to be, I'm 37 right now. Perhaps when I hit 40, I'll see something different in there because of my kids are getting older, and I'll be able to oh shit, I hadn't picked up on that before. So to me, I can't recommend this enough.
Yeah,
obviously. this is a cinephile's film. So if you guys are interested in movies, look, you can break down more visual language. I didn't have an extra 3 hours to break it all down here for you, but I have.
We said it at the start.
I have 15 pages of notes, for fuck's sake. So I mean, there's a lot there. So I mean, I love this movie. I think it's a really good film, and I'm looking forward to.
I'm really glad we got around to it. We finally got to. I'm also really grateful we took that year. Jesus.
Shall we close this out, sir?
Let's do it, man.
All right, so I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I forgot to make a little video thanking everyone who tuned in to our Terminator 2 episode, to a Ghost Story as well. I actually put out Baby Driver again because it was being released. I don't remember where, and Edgar Wright had been tweeting about it again. So I want to thank everyone who's been tuning in to our most recent episodes. I want to thank Stephen M. Keller, at Stephen M. Keller, for sending in his little message, his little tweet. Jameson Worsley, give him a follow as well at Worrell Jen. And Carrie Lynn obviously is really great. And be sure to check out, she was on Hugo's There podcast talking about a book. I forgot what it was.
That's at Hugo's podcast, and it was called the
Three
Body Problem. That's exactly it.
Something like that, yeah. So basically people who've won the Hugo Award. And so that's it. She was on there, and she's a really fascinating conversation. I thought it was really, really good.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Give that a listen as well. So, Carrie Lynn, big shout out to you. That's it for me, man. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And one shout out for me is to the Joy Sandwich podcast, who we actually guested on. The episode's probably not going to be out yet, even when we've done this, because they told us it'd be a while before it gets out. But we had a great time recording with them, and I just got today a little sticker from them, which is adorable, and a little card thanking me for being a guest. Jason got one too. So super big shout out to them, Jessica and Non. Who were just the friendliest, loveliest guys who listened to us yammer on about crap for a fucking lifetime, and they were just the most positive, pleasant people to have a discussion with. Can't recommend the podcast enough. From me, my name's Lee Brady. You can follow me at Big Pic Reviews. You can also see my reviews of films at bigpicturereviews.co.uk. Jason's on there too, as well as a host of writers. It's mostly new releases that we focus on, but we're doing some stuff with some older stuff as well. So it's absolutely, if you want to see more of my takes on films in written form, there's that. Other than that, I'm here at the podcast. So you can just, listen to our back catalog. Jason?
Very cool. And my name is Jason Michael. You can find me at AtlanticSC on Twitter, or you can follow us on our Facebook page, Atlantic Screen Connection Podcast. Please go give that a like. It would be great. If you guys are listening to us on SoundCloud, be sure to click that little heart button. We want to get you guys into it. We've got 26 hearts so far, and that's too little for me. So please show us some love on that. Be great. Don't forget to download our latest episodes on iTunes. Also, we're on Google Play now. So yeah, thank you so much. And please give us a follow on Instagram. I'm actually going to start using that one a little bit more. I like the idea that we're going to be able to share videos and images and whatnot.
Yeah,
it's been a lot of fun. You can follow me at Jason B. Michael. That's going to be my personal page, but you can follow the AtlanticSC Podcast on Instagram as well. And it's been a great time. Thank you so much for tuning in. That's it for us this week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This conversation can serve no purpose anymore. Goodbye.